Hey guys, picture this. You're stepping into a moonlit alley where the ghost of a katana's steel whisper brushes against your cheek, while somewhere a neon billboard flickers from samurai to superpower, like a neon samurai ghost on a caffeine-fueled assembly line. Odd, right? Before we dive in, smash that like button if you love history with a side of dark humor, and drop a comment telling us which era you'd rather time travel to. We'll read every sweaty palmed reply. Dim the lights, grab something crunchy, maybe a rice cracker for authenticity, and let the faint scent of incense and oil-soaked metal settle into your nostrils as you brace yourself for a roller coaster through honor, imperial ambition, and the bizarre reality that a nation once ruled by tea ceremonies now built battleships that could swallow a city whole. You'll feel the chill of Shogun-era bamboo forests melt into the thrum of 1940s factories, hear the clash of swords dissolve into the drone of propellers, and maybe, just maybe, wonder why your Wi-Fi feels slower than a samurai's deliberate stride. So are you ready to trade your comfy sofa for a battlefield of silk, steel, and unsettling ambition? Let's jump in, no armor required, just a curious mind. When Darius finally slipped into the annals of history, his legacy of order and prosperity lingered like the aftertaste of sweet pomegranate wine. Future kings tried to copy his formula, but few could match the sheer audacity of a ruler who turned law, coin, and rode into a symphony of efficiency. The Persian Empire stood as the ancient world's most organized realm, its streets humming with the quiet confidence of a well-kept house. Modern bureaucrats might roll their eyes at the notion of a king-crafted spreadsheet, but they'd be hard-pressed to find a more elegant example of governance. In the end, Darius proved that a well-ordered empire could be as intoxicating as a feast, and as lasting as the stones of Persepolis. In the early 8th century, the mountains of Honshu exhaled a cold, damp breath that clung to every pine needle and the lone traveler's cloak. Mist rolled like a shy dragon over the valleys, muffling the clatter of wooden carts and the occasional bark of a stray dog. From this ghostly theater emerged a new breed of warrior, the samurai, whose steel glinted like sunrise on a koi pond. They practiced sword drills on river stones, their breath visible in the chill air, while the scent of fresh pine sap mixed with the metallic tang of iron. The world was still raw, but the samurai's footsteps began to echo a future rhythm of power. These early swordsmen didn't just swing blades, they whispered a code of honor that sounded like a bedtime story for battle-hardened hearts. Imagine a teenager's promise to clean their room, but replace the chores with loyalty, courage, and a vow to die before dishonor. Welcome to Bushido, the way of the warrior, explained simply as a medieval superhero oath. When a clan chief swore an oath, the samurai felt a shiver down their spine, as if a cold wind had slipped through the tatami mats. The code smelled of incense and blood, a paradox that made even the most stoic monk crack a grin. It bound them tighter than any rope, ensuring that a broken promise felt worse than a broken sword. Clans, once as scattered as autumn leaves, began to knot together like the intricate braids on a geisha's hairdo, thanks to these honor-bound warriors. Battles erupted with the roar of war drums that rattled the very earth, while the clash of swords sang a metallic chorus louder than a rock concert. The air was thick with the iron scent of spilled blood and the sweet rot of fallen bamboo, a reminder that glory came with a price tag of bruises and broken ribs. Yet, after each skirmish, samurai shared sake from cracked porcelain cups, their laughter rising above the lingering smoke of campfires. In those moments, the grudges of yesterday melted into alliances for tomorrow, stitching the patchwork of Japan together one oath at a time. If you think today's superhero movies are over the top, picture a samurai in a full helm trying to fit into a tiny tea house. Talk about a wardrobe malfunction. Their helmets clanged like a busted cymbal, and the occasional stray chicken would sprint across the battlefield, causing more chaos than a rogue Wi-Fi signal. Ironically, these fearsome fighters sometimes argued over who could brew the best miso soup, proving that even warriors can get petty over soup recipes. The clang of swords was sometimes drowned out by the chorus of cicadas, reminding everyone that nature never took a commercial break. And just when you thought the drama couldn't get any richer, a wandering monk would appear, offering cryptic riddles that sounded suspiciously like the plot twists of a binge-worthy anime. By the time the sun set on these mist-laden valleys, the samurai had laid down more than just footprints. They etched a blueprint for a unified nation. Their honor code rippled outward, influencing politics, art, and even the way farmers tended their rice paddies. Everything got a touch of disciplined flair. The scent of fresh rain on tatami mats became a metaphor for renewal, signaling that Japan was ready to rise from its fragmented past. As the first stars pierced the night, the samurai stood shoulder to shoulder, their silhouettes forming a living wall of resolve. Little did they know their gritty, blood-stained saga would one day inspire movies, video games, and a global fascination with the phrase samurai spirit. In the mid-16th century, the air over Owari province crackled like a fireworks show gone rogue, as Oda Nobunaga swaggered onto the stage with a grin that could cut steel. He rode a black horse that smelled of horse shit and gunpowder, his banner flapping like a neon sign proclaiming, "I'm here, deal with it." With a cannon that roared louder than a sumo crowd, he smashed the Imagawa clan's defenses, turning their polished armor into a glittering pile of rusted junk. Nobunaga's cunning was as sharp as his katana. He bribed tea merchants, swapped allies like trading cards, and even ordered the destruction of Buddhist temples that dared to question his power. By the time the sun set, the battlefield smelled of burnt rice fields and fresh ambition, and the warlords whispered, "Who's next?" Enter Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the man who rose from a mud-splattered peasant's shack to the throne of a nation, proving that even a kitchen lad can become a king of sushi-slicing politics. He polished his boots on the blood-stained steps of Nobunaga's castle, then dazzled the court with a tea ceremony so serene it could lull a thunderstorm. Hideyoshi's ambition was a tidal wave. He ordered the construction of Osaka Castle, a stone leviathan that scraped the clouds and smelled of fresh pine and sweat. He dispatched his envoys with gifts of lacquered swords wrapped in silk, then turned those same envoys into executioners when they failed to bow low enough. By the time he declared himself Kampaku, a sort of prime minister-ish title, people could taste the iron tang of his determination in every bowl of miso soup. While Hideyoshi was busy playing empire building Jenga, Tokugawa Ieyasu was planting his feet like a patient gardener, waiting for the perfect season to harvest victory. He watched the Battle of Sekigahara unfold from a hilltop, sipping tea that tasted like bitter resignation, as rival samurai clashed like a chaotic rock concert. When the dust settled, Ieyasu emerged with a smile as calm as a koi pond, clutching a map of Japan that looked less like a country and more like a neatly folded origami crane. He founded Edo, later Tokyo, its streets humming with the chatter of merchants, the clatter of wooden sandals, and the occasional whiff of sizzling yakitori. Iyasu's rule brought a stability that felt like a warm blanket over a winter night, even if that blanket was stitched from the stitched-together loyalties of former foes. With Nobunaga's fire, Hideyoshi's ambition, and Iyasu's patience, the fractured realm finally snapped into a single shogunate, a centralized feudal order that hummed like a well-tuned shamisen. The new bureaucracy marched through castles, stamping documents that smelled of ink and incense, while peasants whispered prayers to the kami for a harvest that wouldn't end in famine. Samurai swapped swords for quills, their armor clanking less on battlefields and more on the wooden floors of council rooms, where the scent of lacquered wood mixed with the occasional waft of fermented sake. The shogun's edicts traveled on horseback couriers whose breath fogged in the cold mornings, delivering news that felt like a fresh breeze after years of stormy conflict. Even the cherry blossoms seemed to bloom with a collective sigh of relief, their pink petals fluttering like confetti at a victorious parade. And so Japan stood on the brink of transformation, a nation that had gone from a chaotic game of musical chairs to a disciplined orchestra. Think Game of Thrones meets Star Wars, but with more rice and less dragons. The shogunate's iron grip set the stage for a future where swords would eventually give way to steel rails and steam engines, and where the samurai's code would echo in the corporate boardrooms of tomorrow. People began to imagine a world where a shogun could command not just armies, but also factories that belched coal smoke like a dragon with a bad cold. The scent of progress was a mix of fresh lacquer, hot iron, and the faint perfume of ambition that lingered in every market stall. As the sun set behind Edo's skyline, the empire whispered, "Watch out, world, this samurai spirit is about to go turbo." The summer of 1853 turned Edo Bay into a stage for a drama no one expected. When Commodore Matthew Perry's black-sheathed steamships sliced through the fog, their smokestacks belched coal-black clouds that smelled like a dragon's barbecue. The Japanese shoreline shivered under the thunder of brass cannons, and the samurai on watch felt the ground tremble like a sumo wrestler's footfall. Perry's crew unfurled a massive flag that read "Open the ports," a polite way of saying, "We're here to take a look and maybe a souvenir." The sight of foreign sailors in top hats and breeches, chewing gum that puffed out bubbles, left the onlookers both horrified and oddly fascinated. The shogunate's council huddled in a dimly lit room, the air thick with incense and the sour stench of fear. Officials whispered that the black ships were a kamikaze of commerce, a storm that would wash away centuries of seclusion. When the treaty finally inked, the first cargo of opium-laced tobacco and glass beads arrived, tickling the nostrils of curious merchants. Port towns erupted with a cacophony of clanging bells, street vendors shouting, and children chasing the strange, squeaky steam beasts that coughed along the river. Yet beneath the excitement, a quiet dread settled like ash, because opening the doors meant inviting the world's germs, ideas, and guns. By 1868, the simmering discontent boiled over into the Meiji Restoration, a political earthquake that toppled the shogun like a toppled tea house. Young samurai, once proud wielders of katana, swapped their swords for pens and plotted to rewrite Japan's destiny. The emperor, who had been a decorative figurehead, suddenly found himself on a throne of reform, his robes shimmering with the promise of progress. Courtiers scrambled to learn French and English, while the common folk wondered if the new laws would ban their favorite sake brews. In the streets of Kyoto, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages blended with the distant roar of a steam locomotive, a soundtrack for a nation stepping into a future it barely understood. The new government hit the forge hard, melting down samurai swords to cast iron rails that stretched like metallic rivers across the islands. Factories puffed out smoke that smelled like burnt tofu mixed with ambition, while workers in overalls sang work songs louder than a karaoke bar. The army swapped bamboo spears for breech-loading rifles, and the Navy christened its first ironclad Congo, which looked like a giant, angry sushi roll slicing through the sea. Schools sprang up overnight, teaching arithmetic and Western etiquette, so that even a farmer could recite the alphabet while planting rice. Yet every night, the ghost of a Ronin could be heard sighing in the wind, wondering why his ancestors' code was now printed on a pamphlet titled Civil Code. This whirlwind of change sparked a cultural tug-of-war, as elders clutched their tea bowls while youth strutted in Western suits that squeaked with every step. Traditional festivals still blazed with lanterns, but now fireworks spelled out the names of foreign capitals, a neon reminder that Japan was no longer an island secret. The irony was palpable. The same nation that once shunned outsiders now exported silk, technology, and even pop culture that would one day make the world binge-watch anime. As the country opened its doors, the scent of fresh pine forests mingled with the metallic tang of industry, a perfume of paradox that defined the era. And so, with a reluctant bow and a daring grin, Japan stepped onto the world stage, ready to rewrite the script of its own legend. By the 1880s, the Japanese archipelago had swapped its tatami mats for steel rails, and the air hummed with the clatter of locomotives. The Meiji government, half-mad scientist and half-visionary merchant, poured money into factories that belched soot like dragon nostrils over Osaka. Young samurai, once masters of the katana, now learned to wield rivets and pistols, their armor replaced by crisp navy uniforms that smelled of oil and sea salt. Newspapers shouted headlines about Western wonders, while street vendors sold electric lamps that flickered like fireflies trapped in glass. In this whirlwind of progress, Japan felt a restless hunger, a craving to test its new muscles on a world that still saw it as a distant curiosity. The first bite came in 1894, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the Chinese fleet at the mouth of the Yalu River, the water turning a murky brown from cannon smoke. Sailors shouted banzai as ironclads ripped through the fog, their guns roaring louder than a sumo crowd at a championship bout. On land, infantry marched through rice paddies that smelled of mud and fresh-cut grass, only to be met by Chinese troops whose morale was as soggy as the monsoon-soaked fields. The fall of Port Arthur felt like watching a giant sushi roll being sliced, precise, inevitable, and oddly satisfying to the Japanese strategists. By the war's end, Japan hoisted its flag over Taiwan, and the world began to whisper that the rising sun was no longer just a sunrise, but a sunrise with a side of ambition. Not content with a single victory, Japan set its sights northward, where the Russian Empire clumsily guarded the frozen coast like a bear in a tuxedo. The 1904 Battle of Tsushima turned the sea into a thunderous orchestra of shells, each explosion echoing like a taiko drum pounding on a battlefield. Japanese destroyers zipped through icy waters, their engines snarling, while Russian sailors slipped on decks slick with seawater and fear. When Port Arthur finally surrendered, the air was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the bitter taste of victory that lingered like stale sake. The world gasped, half in awe and half in disbelief, as a nation once known for cherry blossoms now commanded a navy that could outmaneuver the might of Europe's biggest bear. World War I arrived like a massive, chaotic karaoke night, and Japan grabbed the microphone with a grin. Declaring war on Germany, Japanese troops marched to the Pacific Islands, their boots sinking into sand that smelled of coconut and gun oil. In the shadow of the Great War's trenches, they seized German holdings in Tsingtao, turning the port into a bustling market of seized tea, spices, and the occasional bewildered German officer. Back home, citizens cheered the newsreel footage of flags fluttering over new territories, the sound of brass bands mingling with the distant rumble of artillery. By the armistice, Japan had added a string of Pacific pearls to its crown, proof that even a distant island nation could ride the wave of a global conflict like a surfer on a tsunami. The 1920s saw Japan perched at the zenith of its empire, a towering skyscraper of industry, military might, and cultural swagger. Streets of Tokyo glowed neon, the scent of roasted peanuts mingling with the metallic tang of factories that never slept, while soldiers in crisp uniforms strutted like extras in a Hollywood war epic. Yet beneath the glittering veneer, the empire groaned under the weight of occupied lands, the cries of peasants echoing like a bad karaoke remix of We Are the World. International diplomats raised eyebrows, some comparing Japan's rise to a video game boss level, impressive, but inevitably leading to a final showdown. As the world turned its eyes toward the next decade, Japan stood poised, a superpower humming with ambition, ready to either write a triumphant sequel or stumble into a tragic plot twist. The night the sun set on the Japanese Empire, the sky over Tokyo roared like a wounded dragon, its orange flames licking the clouds, while the distant sound of bombers hummed a grotesque lullaby. Streets that once echoed with the clack of wooden sandals now smelled of soot, rusted metal, and the sour tang of burnt rice. Samurai ghosts, those stoic silhouettes from centuries past, seemed to watch in stunned silence as the imperial flag tattered in a wind that smelled of gunpowder. In the ruins, a lone soldier knelt, his katana rusted beside a crackling fire, the embers whispering a bitter lullaby of lost honor. The empire's twilight was not a graceful curtain call, but a chaotic tumble into darkness, leaving a bitter aftertaste of ash on the tongue of a nation. The day the occupation began, U.S. trucks rolled past shattered pillars, their diesel fumes mixing with the lingering scent of burnt incense. Japanese civilians, gaunt and wide-eyed, stared at helmets like alien headwear, while the soldiers handed out ration cards that smelled of stale wheat and hope. The occupying forces set up loudspeakers that crackled with news of the war's end, their static punctuated by the occasional jazz riff that floated over the cracked sidewalks. In crowded tea houses, the clink of porcelain cups became a nervous soundtrack to whispered jokes about how the emperor now needed a Wi-Fi password. Yet beneath the irony, a quiet determination simmered like a pot of miso soup left too long. The people were ready to rebuild, even if their shirts still bore the ash of defeat. The government, now a modest office of scribes, unveiled a blueprint for a new Japan, its ink still wet and smelling of fresh-cut bamboo. Construction crews hammered steel into the skyline, the clang echoing like samurai swords being forged anew, while the distant hum of neon signs promised a future brighter than any lantern. Street vendors, draped in aprons stained with soy sauce, sold steaming bowls of ramen that steamed like steam from a locomotive, filling the air with a comforting, broth-rich perfume. Young engineers, inspired by the rockets that once shot into the Pacific, swapped their kimono for overalls and joked that they were building rockets for the next Godzilla movie, not war. As the years rolled by, Japan's economy surged like a koi leaping over a waterfall, each splash a testament to a people who turned ash into glittering skyscrapers. In 1947, a thin parchment became the nation's new armor, its Article 9 forbidding war like a samurai code that suddenly banned the very blade that defined it. The drafting committee, half serious, half sardonic, snickered that they were writing a peace treaty with the same ink that once signed battles, a joke that still rattles the conscience like a squeaky wooden floor. Schools taught children the tale of Miyamoto Musashi, yet the textbooks added a footnote. Remember, you can be fierce without a gun. Your katana now lives in a museum, not on the battlefield. This irony made Japanese citizens feel like superheroes in a Marvel movie who refused to use their powers, opting instead to master the art of sushi slicing and origami folding as their new weapons of influence. Yet the samurai spirit, honor, discipline, resilience, remained, humming beneath the surface like the low drone of a Shinkansen, propelling the nation forward without ever needing to fire a shot. Today, when tourists wander through Kyoto's lantern-lit alleys, they hear the distant echo of taiko drums mingling with the hum of bullet trains, a soundtrack that fuses centuries in a single breath. The pop culture icon Godzilla, once a metaphor for nuclear terror, now stomps across movie screens as a sarcastic reminder that Japan can turn its nightmares into blockbuster gold. In boardrooms, executives bow like modern-day daimyo, negotiating deals over cups of matcha that smell of earth after rain, their smiles as disciplined as a samurai's stare. Even the national anthem, Kimigeo, drifts over stadiums where baseball, America's export, flies faster than a shuriken, proving that the old and new can share the same field. So Japan stands at twilight, its legacy a patchwork quilt stitched with the threads of ancient swords and neon LEDs, forever balancing the ghost of its warrior past with the quiet promise of peace. The sun draped Edo's wooden rooftops in amber, and the air smelled of fresh rice and lingering incense. Young samurai Takashi practiced his kata on a tatami that squeaked like a squeaky mouse, while merchant Eiko haggled over silk in a market that buzzed like a beehive. Lantern light flickered against the shogun's stone walls, casting shadows that looked like ancient ghosts playing hide and seek. Their laughter mixed with the clatter of wooden carts, but a distant rumble on the horizon hinted that the world beyond the river was stirring. Even the koi in the palace pond seemed to pause, as if they sensed the first note of a change that would soon drown their quiet. Yet beneath the festive clamor, the city's veins pulsed with a sluggish rhythm, as if the shogunate's policies were a rusted gear grinding in place. Takashi watched his fellow samurai polish their swords with a reverence that bordered on obsession, their blades reflecting a sky that refused to change. Eiko's shop overflowed with lacquered boxes, the sweet scent of persimmon mingling with the sour tang of cheap sake, a reminder that commerce thrived while ideas stalled. The streets echoed with the chant of loyalty like a broken record, and the occasional stray dog barked at nothing, as if mocking the endless ceremony. In the back alleys, old Ronan whispered about the wind from the west, their words slipping through the night like a secret meme nobody understood. One misty morning, black smoke curled over the harbor, and a fleet of foreign ships, gleaming iron beasts with flags that looked like neon emojis, loomed like angry jellyfish. Cannons thudded a low, hungry growl, and the salty spray slapped the faces of onlookers, making Aiko's hair stick to her cheek like clingy ramen noodles. The samurais' helmets clanged in alarm, their disciplined steps turning into a jittery dance that resembled a video game boss battle. Children screamed, "Kaiju," as the massive hulls cut through the water, and the scent of oil mixed with the familiar aroma of grilled fish, a bizarre perfume of progress and panic. Takashi felt his heart pound like a taiko drum, each beat a question: defend the old order or ride the wave of this foreign frenzy. The shogunate's envoys scrambled like startled crabs, clutching scrolls that promised peaceful trade while secretly fearing colonial chaos. Takashi, sword still sheathed, stared at the foreign flags and imagined them as giant Pokémon cards, collectible, powerful, and utterly disruptive. Yaeko, ever the pragmatist, slipped a silver coin into Takashi's palm, whispering, "Maybe we sell tea to them and buy a steam engine. At least we won't starve like a cat in a rainstorm." Their conversation crackled with irony, as the old bamboo fence between the samurai's honor and the merchant's profit began to splinter like a cheap plastic toy. The city's murmurs rose into a chorus, half chanting banzai, and half humming a tune from a distant land, the soundtrack of a society caught between a bow and a Wi-Fi signal. As night fell, fireworks borrowed from the foreigners burst over the castle, painting the sky with colors that made the shogun's armor look like a tired cosplay outfit. Takashi laughed, the sound echoing off stone walls, realizing that the old ways could be as fragile as a paper crane tossed into a typhoon. Yaeko smiled, her eyes reflecting the sparks, and mused that perhaps the next era would need both a katana and a compass, a blend of swords and spreadsheets. The wind carried the distant chant of Meiji, a name that sounded like a superhero's call to action, promising a future where Japan could finally upgrade from floppy disks to real disks. And so, under the glow of foreign lanterns and the lingering scent of incense, the shadows of the Tokugawa began to recede, making room for a new dawn that smelled faintly of iron, ambition, and a hint of sushi roll optimism. Takashi slipped into the dim tatami room behind the tea house, where the air tasted of incense and old lacquer. He hunched over a tattered Western map that smelled faintly of printer ink, a scent as alien as sushi on a skateboard. The reformers whispered like wind through bamboo, their voices low enough that only the shoji screens could hear. It felt like a secret fan club for samurai who'd binge-watch Game of Thrones and then demand a new plot twist for Japan. A spark of change flickered in his chest, louder than the kettle's whine. Yaeko steered her merchant ship through the choppy Seto Inland Sea, the deck slick with salt and the smell of tar mingling with fresh wasabi. Beneath crates of silk and barrels of sake, she tucked slim volumes of Western science, their pages whispering of steam engines and electric lights. She smuggled knowledge the way smugglers hide contraband cigarettes, slipping a copy of Enlightenment under a bale of rice. By lantern light, she imagined the crew reading about iron horses while the gulls squawked like curious critics. The cargo hold swayed, and with each roll the books thumped like tiny, eager hearts. The daimyos arrived in a procession of clanking armor, their visors glinting like polished samurai helmets at a rock concert. Takashi presented the foreign diagrams, and Eiko unfurled a scroll that smelled of ink and ambition, prompting the lord to snarl, "No more Western pizza on my table." The shoji doors slammed shut, sealing a heat that rose like an angry kettle. Yet the reformers stood firm, their voices steady as the drum beats of a festival parade. The tension crackled, a silent thunder that reverberated through the pine-scented hallway. Within the ranks of the samurai, unease spread like a rumor about a cursed karaoke machine. Some muttered that the new ideas felt like a fresh anime season, exciting but unsettling, while others clutched their swords, the metal smelling of iron and horse sweat. A veteran lance-bearer quipped, "We're not Jedi, but the Empire's getting a new lightsaber," a wink that sparked a nervous chuckle among the stoic crowd. Their armor creaked, their breath fogged in the cold morning air, as they wrestled with the fear of losing honor for gadgets that hummed like distant cicadas. The clash of tradition and innovation sounded like a drum circle gone rogue. The secret circle's whispers grew into a roar that rattled the stone walls of Edo, echoing like distant war drums. Takashi watched the sunrise spill orange light over the city, its hue as vivid as a sushi roll glistening on a platter. Yako opened the hidden crates, and ideas spilled out like tea pouring over a porcelain cup, fragrant and unstoppable. The daimyos trembled, the samurai shifted their stances, and the air crackled with the scent of fresh ink and burning lanterns. From the ashes of feudal rigidity rose a modern Japan, humming like a newly tuned shamisen ready to play a different song. The night the shogunate unleashed its iron fist, Edo's lanterns flickered like nervous fireflies. Drums of warning thumped through the streets, echoing off wooden walls and stirring the scent of rain-soaked tatami. Officials in lacquered armor marched like a bad sequel to a samurai movie, their swords flashing with bureaucratic menace. In the taverns, whispers turned to shouts as the populace realized the crackdown was no polite tea ceremony, but a full-blown storm. The city held its breath, waiting for the first bolt of oppression to strike. Takashi, the charismatic reformist with a habit of quoting Shakespeare between petitions, was snatched from his modest study while polishing a bamboo brush. The guards' boots splashed in the puddles, their clank louder than a K-pop chorus in a quiet shrine. He was dragged to a dark cell that smelled of damp stone and stale fear, his cuffs clinking like cheap jewelry. Even the rats seemed to mutter, "You can't silence a voice that sings revolution," as they scurried over his discarded notes. The shogunate's message was clear. Dissent would be treated like a bad karaoke performance, silenced and forgotten. Seiko felt the cold hand of danger when a messenger, trembling like a newborn koi, slipped a warning into her palm. Her family would be burned if she continued to aid the rebels. The scent of incense mixed with the acrid tang of gunpowder as soldiers prowled her family's courtyard, their armor rattling like a haunted suit of armor in a haunted house. Her mother clutched a worn kimono, its fabric smelling of lavender and old tea, while her younger brother stared at a broken toy samurai, its plastic blade chipped. Daiko's heart hammered louder than a taiko drum, each beat a reminder that the stakes had turned from political to personal. She whispered a defiant promise to the wind, hoping it would carry her resolve beyond the looming flames. Across the islands, the nation quivered on the edge of civil war, as if a giant was about to tip a teacup over a porcelain table. Farmers heard the distant roar of cannons and the metallic tang of blood in the air, while merchants smelled burnt rice and the sweet rot of abandoned fruit stalls. Villagers gathered around hearths, their eyes wide like anime protagonists discovering a plot twist, debating whether to pick up swords or picket signs. The shogunate's crackdown acted like a spoiler for a story everyone was still writing, turning hope into a cliffhanger. In every tavern and temple, the question echoed: would Japan rise like a phoenix or crumble like a stale rice cake? Amid the chaos, Takashi's arrest became the talk of the town, more viral than a cat video on the internet of the future. Eiko, now a reluctant heroine, slipped through alleys smelling of soy sauce and fear, her resolve as sharp as a sushi knife. The shogunate's heavy hand slipped on the slick surface of rebellion, slipping, sliding, and finally cracking like a dropped smartphone screen. As the storm of opposition roared, the people learned that even a single spark can set a bamboo forest ablaze. And so, with fists clenched and jokes about samurai drama cracking the tension, Japan edged toward a new dawn, ready to rewrite its own epic. The air in Edo crackled like a summer storm as disgruntled samurai from Satsuma and Choshu marched toward the shogun's palace, their banners flapping like angry koi. Charismatic leaders, think rock star rebels with swords, shouted slogans that sounded like karaoke verses, demanding the old bakufu step down. The shogun, pale as a moonlit rice field, could barely muster a sigh before his retainers bowed and handed over the seal. In that tense moment, the scent of incense mixed with the metallic tang of fresh blood, sealing the end of centuries-old rule. With the shogun's resignation echoing through the streets, the prison doors of Edo swung open and Takashi stumbled into daylight, blinking at the sun like a cat after a long nap. Eiko, whose gossip network rivaled the fastest internet of today, rallied merchants, artisans, and even tea-house geishas to the cause, their chatter forming a chorus louder than a temple bell. Lanterns flickered as they mapped out a provisional council in cramped backrooms, the smell of soy sauce and spilled sake mingling with the excitement. The city's heartbeat quickened, each footstep a drumroll toward a new era. At the imperial palace, the young Emperor Meiji rose from his throne with a confidence that could outshine any superhero landing, his robes rustling like wind through bamboo. Courtiers gasped as he declared the restoration, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a katana through silk. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others clapping like a troupe of kabuki actors, while street vendors tossed dumplings into the air in celebration. Suddenly, the scent of fresh pine incense was replaced by the sharp aroma of gunpowder, signaling the first edicts that would melt the feudal shackles. The new government wasted no time, drafting reforms that read like a sci-fi manual for 19th-century Japan: compulsory schooling, a standing army dressed in Western uniforms, and railways that hissed like serpents across the mountains. Farmers who once bowed to local lords now held tax ledgers that smelled of ink and sweat, their faces a mix of hope and bewilderment. Ironically, samurai tried to trade their swords for pocket watches, a sight that would have made even a Marvel hero raise an eyebrow. Yet the clatter of looms and the clang of factories reminded everyone that progress could be as noisy and as messy as a summer festival after a rainstorm. By the end of the year, the old castles stood like tired grandparents, their stone walls covered in graffiti of progress and the occasional stray cherry blossom petal. People whispered that the country had gone from a slow-cooked broth to a microwave meal, fast, hot, and a little chaotic. Yet beneath the clamor of modernization, the spirit of the samurai persisted, now channeling its discipline into rail conductors and school teachers. As the sun set over a skyline dotted with smokestacks, Japan took a deep breath, ready to rewrite its story on a page that smelled faintly of ink, oil, and ambition. The year the Meiji Constitution was inked, the nation's pulse quickened like a drum roll before a fireworks show. Steel rails unfurled across the islands, snapping the countryside into a metallic web that sang with the clatter of wheels and the occasional squeal of a frightened goat. Travelers marveled at the sight of steam locomotives, puffing black clouds that smelled like burnt sugar and ambition. In bustling ports, the clang of hammers echoed against the tide, as if the sea itself were being hammered into a new shape. Even the old samurai, once proud of their swords, found themselves humming the tune of progress, half-heartedly comparing the locomotive's roar to a dragon's sneeze. Schools sprouted like bamboo shoots after a monsoon, their roofs gleaming with freshly tiled tiles. Inside, chalk dust swirled like ghostly fireworks while eager children scribbled formulas that smelled of ink and fresh pine. Teachers, many of them former scholars of Confucian classics, now brandished beakers and compasses, trading ancient poetry for Newton's laws with a wink. The cafeteria served rice balls next to steaming bowls of miso soup, the aroma mingling with the faint scent of ozone from the new telegraph wires humming in the background. Laughter bounced off the walls as pupils tried to pronounce gravity and accidentally sounded like a karaoke version of a samurai chant. By then Takashi and Eiko had become the village's walking history books, their hair silvered like moonlit rice fields. They would sit on the porch of the old tea house, the wooden boards creaking under their weight, and recount the night they helped hide a rebel flag beneath a bundle of firewood. Their eyes twinkled when they remembered how a clumsy courier once tripped over a newly laid track, spilling a sack of coal that turned the street into a makeshift fireworks display. "We thought we were just surviving," Takashi would say, "but we were actually auditioning for the role of nation builders." Eiko, ever the pragmatist, added that the only thing more stubborn than a feudal mindset was a stubborn boil on a cold winter morning. The islands throbbed with industry, smokestacks puffing like giant incense burners that scented the air with oil and iron. Factories roared day and night, their machines grinding metal into gleaming swords of a different kind, rails, gears, and the occasional locomotive wheel that shone like a polished obi. Workers clad in soot-stained overalls sang work songs that sounded suspiciously like old folk tunes, their voices rising over the hiss of steam and the clank of pistons. Nightfall brought a neon glow from lanterns powered by electric currents, a sight that made the moon look like a jealous understudy. Even the distant mountains seemed to lean in, listening to the rhythm of a country that had finally learned to march to its own beat. As the sun set behind Mount Fuji, casting a pink blush over the newly forged era, Takashi and Eiko felt a quiet pride that rivaled the roar of a sumo crowd. They imagined Japan as a colossal mecca, part ancient spirit, apart modern machinery, charging forward with a confidence that would make any superhero jealous. The scent of fresh paint on a newly built bridge mingled with the salty sea breeze, reminding them that bridges were now being built not just between islands, but between past and future. They chuckled at the irony that the very swords they once wielded were now displayed in museums, while their grandchildren rode bicycles faster than any horse ever could. With a final sip of tea, they whispered to the wind, "Our courage was the spark, the rest was just the fireworks." When the Tokugawa shogunate finally locked the country's doors in 1603, the sea still whispered rebellion. Along the jagged coastline of Edo Bay, a lanky shipwright named Takahiro hammered pine planks while Admiral Matsumoto, a man whose eyebrows could intimidate a thunderstorm, plotted patrol routes. The salty wind slapped their faces, and the distant cries of gulls sounded like a chorus of gossiping samurai. Every sunrise painted the water in bruised oranges, promising both danger and opportunity. In that hazy dawn, the fledgling Japanese maritime force took its first tentative steps toward legend. Takahiro's wooden junks looked more like floating tea houses than war machines, yet they were sturdy enough to swallow a wave and spit it out with a grin. The scent of fresh pine mingled with the acrid bite of tar, creating a perfume that could wake a lazy monk from meditation. Matsumoto supervised the rigging with the precision of a sushi chef slicing tuna, each rope tightened to a perfect knot, each sail hoisted like a banner of defiance. When the crew sloshed their oars, the splash sounded like a drum roll for an impending showdown. Even the sea crabs seemed to cheer, clicking their claws in a rhythm that could rival any pop song chorus. Pirate raids had become the unwanted soundtrack of the coast, their black flags fluttering like bad hair days for the locals. One moonless night, a band of marauding wok-wielding buccaneers tried to board a junk, only to be met by Matsumoto's crew swinging cutlasses with the enthusiasm of teenagers at a video game tournament. The clash rang out, metal clanged, wood splintered, and the salty spray tasted like iron-flavored ramen broth. Takahiro, perched on the bow, shouted orders that cut through the chaos like a katana through silk. By dawn, the pirates limped away, their treasure replaced by a bruised ego and a lingering smell of burnt incense. Just as the Japanese learned to kick pirate butt, Western traders arrived, their ships looking like oversized wooden dragons with sails as black as a Netflix binge-watch marathon. The Dutch and the Portuguese dangled exotic goods, spices, mirrors, and the occasional brass telescope, like shiny toys tempting a cat. Matsumoto eyed them warily, remembering his grandfather's warning. "Beware the man who offers you silk and steals your soul." Negotiations turned into a game of chess, each side moving pieces while the sea hissed beneath, indifferent to human scheming. In the end, the shogunate let the traders dock, but only after demanding tribute in the form of a handful of samurai-styled lacquer boxes, a deal that felt as odd as swapping Pokémon cards for sushi. Thus the dawn of the sea warriors glimmered, a mix of creaking wood, fierce ambition, and the occasional absurdity that only history can serve up. The junks may have looked humble, but they carried the heartbeat of a nation ready to carve its name into the waves. Takahiro's craftsmanship and Matsumoto's iron will forge a legacy that would later swell into ironclad battleships. Think of it as upgrading from a flip phone to a smartphone, only louder. The coastal patrols became the first verses of a saga that would echo across oceans, inspiring future admirals to dream bigger than the horizon. And somewhere, a mischievous pirate ghost still laughs, wondering why he ever thought a wooden junk could outwit a samurai with a sense of humor. When the black ships of Commodore Perry sliced through the sunrise like a fleet of iron sharks, the harbor of Edo erupted in a chorus of gasps and clanging bells. The smell of coal and tar mingled with the salty breath of the sea, choking the courtiers who had never seen a hull that didn't creak under wind alone. Samurai on watch shouted, "What sorcery is this?" while the shogun's advisors whispered that the world had turned its back on the samurai's honor. In the shadow of those smokestacks, Japan felt a painful awakening, a reminder that the old wooden fleet was as out of date as a floppy disk in a smartphone era. The shogunate's ink-stained maps were redrawn overnight, and a new, uneasy tide began to pull the nation toward the west. Enter Takahiro, a lanky scholar with a penchant for Dutch cheese and a secret stash of sketchbooks, who boarded a Dutch merchant ship bound for Rotterdam. He stepped onto the bustling slipway, where the air was thick with the scent of oil, hot iron, and the occasional whiff of fish market garbage. Dutch shipwrights, half amused and half bewildered, showed him sleek hulls that cut water like a samurai's katana, their ribs reinforced with iron ribs that sang a metallic hum when the tide struck. Takahiro feverishly copied lines, noting how the decks were covered in tarred canvas that didn't flake like the paper scrolls back home. He sent his drawings home on a carrier pigeon that probably thought it was delivering love letters, and the shogunate's scribes gasped at the foreign geometry that promised speed and steel. Back in Edo, Admiral Matsumoto, a grizzled veteran still scented with gunpowder and seaweed, faced a court split like a broken oar. The traditionalists clutched lacquered fans and muttered prayers to the wind kami, insisting a true warrior's soul could not be forged in a furnace. Matsumoto, however, slipped into the night like a ninja, meeting engineers in hidden tea houses where oil lamps flickered over blueprints. He whispered plans for iron-clad experiments behind shoji screens, the air thick with the metallic clang of distant forges and the sour smell of stale tea. Each secret meeting felt like a betrayal of centuries of honor, yet his eyes glittered with a daring that made even the sternest samurai imagine riding a mechanical dragon. When the first prototype emerged, a hulking iron beast with wooden planks bolted like a sushi roll wrapped in steel, the samurai sailors stared, half in awe, half in horror. The ship's hull groaned louder than a sumo wrestler's grunt, and the scent of hot iron burned their nostrils, reminding them of a forge gone rogue. Some swore it was a cursed leviathan, while others whispered that it could slice through waves faster than a shuriken through silk. Matsumoto ordered a trial run, and as the ironclad cut the water, the crew felt a thrill akin to riding a roller coaster built by a mad inventor. Hope and fear tangled like a knot in a fishing net, and the samurai's battle cries turned into a chorus of nervous laughter, as if they'd just been cast in a low-budget Star Wars sequel. The ironclad's debut sparked a fever that spread through the shogunate like a rumor about a secret love affair between a geisha and a samurai. Court gossip mixed with the clang of hammers, and soon every daimyo wanted a piece of the new metal tide, even if it meant swapping their ancestral swords for riveted steel. Matsumoto, now half hero, half villain in the eyes of his peers, smiled wryly, knowing that the future would be a mash-up of tradition and technology, think samurai in leather jackets riding cyber sharks. The Navy's next chapter would be written in iron and steam, but the ghost of those wooden ships still haunted the dockyards, sighing like old ghosts in the night. And so, as the sun set behind the silhouette of the first ironclad, Japan stood at the edge of a new horizon, ready to surf the western tide with a grin, a gunpowder-stained nose, and a heart that still beat to the rhythm of the ocean. When the Meiji Restoration slammed open Japan's doors in 1868, the nation caught a wild fever of modernization that felt like a dragon in a hot spring, steam hissing, scales glinting, and everyone scrambling to drink the broth. The old shogunate's quiet courtyards erupted into bustling streets where lantern light fought neon glare, and the scent of fresh lacquer clashed with the acrid bite of coal. Young samurai, still polishing their katana, found themselves swapping steel for steel plate, and the air buzzed with the clang of hammers like a rock concert in a temple. Even the imperial palace seemed to whisper, upgrade or be left in the ash. This restless energy set the stage for an iron-blooded rebirth that would soon roar across the sea. In the newly minted navy yards, workshops swelled like giant koi ponds, full of men and women hammering, welding, and coaxing iron into shape, while the river nearby hissed with steam. The first steam-powered iron vessels rolled out, their hulls smelling of hot oil, rust, and the lingering perfume of pine incense burned by nervous apprentices. Workers shouted orders over the roar of pistons, their voices rising like a chorus of samurai chanting in unison with a locomotive's whistle. Each rivet-driven home sounded like a tiny war drum, and the occasional plume of black smoke painted the sky a gritty, patriotic gray. By night, lanterns flickered against steel walls, casting shadows that looked like giant, metallic dragons perched on the dock. But not everyone cheered the clang of progress. A fierce debate crackled hotter than the furnaces. Traditionalists, still clutching katana-sharpened pride, muttered that the soul of Japan lived in the curve of a blade, not the curve of a hull, while progressives waved blueprints like samurai banners, promising a fleet that could rival any Western Leviathan. The clash was as theatrical as a kabuki play, one side in silk kimono, the other in soot-stained overalls, each arguing over whether the nation's future should be sung in poetry or powered by pistons. The heated debates often ended with a shared sip of sake, the bitter liquid settling the tempers like oil on water. Ironically, the very disagreements forged a sharper resolve, tempering Japan's resolve like steel in a forge. Amid the steam and steel, the warship Congo emerged, a hulking hybrid that looked like a mecha straight out of a 1970s anime, half traditional cruiser, half modern dreadnought. Its prow bore a fierce prow figure of a dragon, while beneath the deck roared engines that sounded like 1,000 angry tigers in a subway tunnel. Engineers wrestled with the ship's weight, sometimes slipping on oil slicks that smelled of burnt garlic and metal, laughing nervously as they shouted, "Do not feed the Congo." The launch ceremony turned into a circus. Fireworks clanged, sailors sang karaoke renditions of "We Are the Champions," and the ship's first steam burst sent a plume of fog so thick it looked like the sea itself had sneezed. When Congo finally cut through the water, the hull sang a metallic hymn, echoing Japan's audacious claim to the world stage. The birth of Congo cemented a new national myth, one that mixed the ghostly whispers of ancient swords with the thunderous roar of industrial might. Citizens gathered on riverbanks, their faces lit by flickering lanterns, breathing in salty air tinged with coal dust, and marveling at the ship's silhouette against the moon, like a futuristic samurai prowling the night. The irony was delicious. A nation that once feared the West now rode the very steam that once symbolized foreign intrusion. Yet the pride that swelled with each puff of smoke was as intoxicating as the strongest sake, forging a collective identity that could weather any storm. In the echo of Congo's bell, the future of Japan's Imperial Navy rang clear. Steel, steam, and a dash of daring humor would steer it forward. The night before the Battle of Tsushima crackled with nervous energy, as the sleek steel hull of the newly commissioned Mikasa lay moored under a moon that looked suspiciously like a giant, indifferent eye. Admiral Togo Hihikairo paced the deck, his boots scuffing the wooden planks that still clung to the memory of Japan's oar-driven past. He could smell the salty tang of the sea mingling with the oily perfume of fresh coal, a scent that promised both power and peril. Around him, a fleet of dreadnoughts glinted like a row of angry cats, each gun turret itching for action. The crew whispered jokes about turning the Russians into sushi, a gallows humor that masked their steel-clad resolve. At dawn, a haze rose from the water like steam from a giant kettle, obscuring the horizon just enough to make the approaching Russian Baltic squadron look like ghost ships in a bad horror movie. The Japanese guns rumbled awake, their booms echoing across the sea and rattling the sailors' teeth. The deck swarmed with men loading shells, their hands slick with sweat and the greasy residue of gunpowder, while seagulls dodged like paparazzi around a celebrity. Togo gave the signal, a flash of light that cut through the fog like a cinematic cut scene, and the Japanese line surged forward with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance. The smell of scorched cordite hung heavy, a reminder that the air itself was about to become a battlefield. When the Russian fleet finally emerged, their black smokestacks puffed out clouds that smelled faintly of musty tea and distant winter, an ironic hint of their Baltic origins. Their ironclad ships rolled like angry turtles, their guns glinting, ready to unleash a torrent of steel. The first salvo cracked the silence, a thunderous roar that rattled the very marrow of every sailor, and shells screamed past like angry teenagers on skateboards. Mikasa's main battery answered with a volley that shredded the Russian lead ship, sending splinters of metal and a spray of seawater into the sky like confetti at a wild party. The water churned, turning a bright blue sea into a frothy, muddy mess that smelled of burnt metal and raw fish. The tide of battle turned faster than a plot twist in a tokusatsu series, as Mikasa's flagship gun pierced the Russian line, ripping a hole that swallowed a whole gun turret like a cartoon vacuum. Russian decks erupted in chaos. Men shouted in guttural Russian, the sound mingling with the clang of metal and the occasional squeak of a boot slipping on wet deck. Togo, ever the cool-headed commander, ordered a daring crossing maneuver that sliced through the enemy's formation like a sushi knife through nigiri, leaving stunned Russians flailing. The Japanese crews, eyes wide with a mix of terror and exhilaration, cracked jokes about going full Godzilla, even as they watched the enemy's hull crumble. The battle's roar rose to a crescendo, a symphony of explosions, shouts, and the sickly sweet smell of burning oil. When the smoke finally cleared, the sea was littered with twinkling wreckage, each twisted piece a testament to the ferocity of the fight. The Japanese flag fluttered triumphantly over a wrecked Russian hull, its colors stark against the gray sky, a picture that would soon splash across newspapers worldwide like an early meme. The world gasped, some in admiration, others in disbelief, that a nation that once paddled in wooden boats could now command a fleet that roared louder than a Hollywood blockbuster. Japan's navy, drenched in salt and blood, had earned its place among the great powers, its sailors feeling both pride and the lingering, gritty taste of victory. And so the Mikasa's thunderous roar echoed long after the cannons fell silent, a reminder that steel can speak louder than words. When the guns fell silent, the Imperial Navy rolled out a new brigade of steel leviathans, their hulls glinting like polished katana blades under the spring sun. Young engineers, chewing on rice crackers, crowded the drafting tables, scribbling blueprints that looked more like anime mecha than ships. Takahiro, the old shipwright whose hands still smelled of tar and seaweed, watched the parade of iron with a mix of pride and a twitch of nostalgia. He remembered the creak of wooden hulls, the salty spray, and the way a wind could coax a sail to sing. Now the Navy's roar came from roaring diesel engines, a sound that made the harbor tremble like a drunk sumo wrestler. The shipyards roared awake at dawn, hammers pounding like a taiko drum and sparks flying like fireworks at a summer festival. Riveters swore by the clang of steel, their bodies slick with sweat and lubricating oil that smelled like burnt soy sauce. Every newly forged turret was a playground for engineers who imagined their guns could launch rockets to the moon. Yes, even they joked about a space battleship Yamato before the anime ever aired. The steel plates were welded with a heat so fierce it turned the air into a living furnace, and the smell of molten iron lingered longer than a lingering karaoke encore. Yet beneath the pride, a thin thread of dread twitched. Each new battleship carried the ghosts of men who never saw their wooden ancestors return home. When the fleet sailed out of Yokohama, the world gasped at the sight of steel silhouettes cutting through fog like a samurai's blade through butter. The battleships claimed victories that were splashed across headlines, their cannons roaring louder than a shonen hero's battle cry. But the triumph was peppered with tragedy, ships that sank with a sickening splash, crews swallowed by the sea while their flags still fluttered in the wind, the sort of horror that makes you think of a horror movie, but with real blood and brass. The Navy's fame grew, yet the cost was a lingering bitterness that tasted like stale miso broth left too long on the stove. In taverns, veterans laughed about the good old days, while the younger cadets whispered about the price of glory, as if it were a secret cheat code you could cheat on. Now Takahiro leans against a rust-spotted railing, his hair as white as the foam that laps the pier, watching the sunrise bleed gold over the harbor's steel teeth. He points at the newest battleship, a hulking beast named Congo, and tells a ragtag group of apprentices that a ship is more than steel. It's a living poem written in rivets and sacrifice. The salty wind slaps his weathered cheeks, the distant clang of a boiler ticking like a metronome of fate, and the scent of fresh fish market blends with the oily perfume of the waiting fleet. His voice carries a wry humor, comparing the ship's silhouette to a giant robot that would make even a Pixar animator grin. As the morning light catches the polished decks, Takahiro smiles, knowing his legacy is etched into every bolt, even if the world will someday forget the man who once built wooden dhows. The tide of history has turned forever. The wooden shanties of his youth have become museum relics, while the steel giants now dominate the horizon like modern colossi. Takahiro feels both relief and melancholy, relief that his country rides a wave of power, melancholy that the roaring engines drown out the soft sighs of the sea. He chuckles, recalling how he once tried to convince a stubborn officer that a ship's soul isn't measured in tonnage, but in the laughter of its crew, an idea that earned him a playful ear pull. As the sun climbs higher, the harbor glitters, and the steel fleet stands ready, a testament to human ambition and the absurdity of trying to outrun destiny. In that glow, Takahiro's heart swells like a drum, echoing the old adage, "You can't steer the tide, but you can build a better boat to ride it." The first light of sunrise filtered through shoji screens, painting the training yard with a honeyed glow. Young Takashi, still smelling of fresh-cut bamboo and his mother's night market ramen, knelt beside the weathered scrolls of his clan. Master Hiroshi unfurled a tattered parchment, his voice crackling like a firecracker, and declared that the age of the swords was also the age of the code. Takashi felt the weight of his ancestral armor settle onto his shoulders, each metal plate humming almost as loudly as the distant rooster. The air buzzed with anticipation, as if the very wind whispered, "Welcome to the dawn of the code." Hiroshi traced the 6 virtues of Bushido with his calligraphy brush: rectitude, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, loyalty, each stroke smelling of ink and old tea. He explained rectitude as a compass that never points south, even when the Lord offers a sack of gold that smells like burnt incense. Courage, he said, was not just charging into battle like a reckless teenager in a video game, but standing firm when the world hands you a lukewarm bowl of miso. Benevolence meant sharing your rice, even when you're starving, and respect required bowing low enough to see the tatami's knots. Honesty and loyalty were the twin lanterns that would guide Takashi through foggy politics, and Hiroshi winked, "Think of them as the Wi-Fi of the soul. Without signal, you're lost." By noon, a messenger arrived, his horse snorting clouds of dust that smelled like iron and sweat. He bore a sealed edict from Lord Matsumoto, demanding that his retainers deliver a priceless jade amulet to a rival clan by moonrise. The edict smelled of ozone and ambition, and the courtiers whispered that refusing would earn them a swift, unsavory death, like a sushi roll left out in the sun too long. Takashi's heart hammered like a drum, and his breath tasted of wasabi fire as he stared at the glittering jewel nestled in a lacquer box. The political web was tightening, and Hiroshi's voice cut through the tension. "Your first test of honor begins now. Choose the path that makes your soul less crunchy." That night a cloaked thief slipped into the Lord's chambers, his boots leaving faint footprints that reeked of damp earth and desperation. He tried to steal the jade amulet, but Takashi intercepted him, the clang of steel echoing like a taiko drum in the silent hall. The thief begged, claiming his village was starving, and the scent of burning thatch filled the room, making Takashi's stomach churn. Remembering the virtue of benevolence, Takashi offered a modest sack of rice instead of the amulet, a gesture that made the thief's eyes wet with gratitude and the air hum with an uneasy peace. He then presented the jade to Lord Matsumoto, who nodded approvingly, though his breath carried the faint metallic tang of political intrigue. As the moon slipped behind the mountain, Takashi stood atop the castle wall, the wind whipping his kimono and carrying the distant sound of a kodo playing a melancholy tune. He felt the 6 virtues settle into his bones like a warm broth, each one a flavor that would season his future deeds. The experience tasted bittersweet, much like the first bite of a miso caramel, unexpected, uncomfortable, yet oddly satisfying. Hiroshi clapped him on the shoulder, chuckling. "You've earned your place among the samurai, and you've just earned a lifetime subscription to the Bushido streaming service." From that night forward, Takashi carried the code like a lantern, its glow guiding the modern Japan that would later echo his ancient oath in boardrooms, streets, and even in the way they politely bow before a sushi chef. The morning mist clung to the rice paddies like a shy cat, and Takashi rode up the winding dirt road toward a humble peasant village trembling under the shadow of marauding bandits. The scent of burning straw mingled with the earthy perfume of freshly turned soil, while children's terrified cries pierced the cool air. Takashi frowned, remembering his father's stern warning that a samurai's blade should protect the weak, not just glitter in a lord's hall. He tightened his grip on the daisho, feeling the cold metal vibrate against his palm like a restless bee. In that moment, the weight of Bushido honor, loyalty, and courage pressed against his chest tighter than a kimono belt. When the bandits burst into the market, their iron swords sang a discordant hymn and their laughter sounded like cracked porcelain. Takashi lunged forward, slicing a rusted pike in half, while a stray pork bone splattered his armor with greasy gore, pleasantly gross, like a bad sushi special. The villagers gasped, clutching at wilted chrysanthemums, their fear turning into a trembling hope that flared brighter than a lantern in a storm. He recalled the Bushido tenet of rectitude, the moral compass that says you must act correctly even if the odds stare you down like a grumpy sumo. With each swing, the samurai's discipline sharpened, turning panic into a disciplined dance of steel and resolve. Just as the last bandit fell, a messenger from the rival Kurigane clan slipped through the smoke, bearing a silk scroll sealed with a blood-red chrysanthemum, an invitation to betray. Takashi's heart thumped like a taiko drum, the irony not lost on him that a friend would ask him to betray his own oath, as if a ninja had just offered to swap his sushi roll for a tofu burger. He stared at the scroll, the ink smelling of pine resin and regret, while the village elder whispered prayers that sounded like a low, rumbled bass line. Against the backdrop of rustling bamboo, Takashi weighed the Bushido code of loyalty against the stark reality of political survival, feeling the tension coil like a spring in his back. He chose to refuse, slamming the scroll to the ground with a thud that echoed through the thatched roofs, a tiny act of rebellion against the game's cheat code. Night fell and the amber glow of lanterns revealed a lone geisha named Eiko, whose eyes sparkled like mischief-filled koi. She offered Takashi a cup of sake, its scent of fermented rice mingling with the distant smell of incense, and whispered a secret yearning for adventure beyond the battlefield. The samurai felt the tug of personal desire, romance, freedom, perhaps a career change to become a potter, clashing with his duty to the village and his clan. He remembered Bushido's self-control clause, which insists you master your cravings lest they eat you like a stray dog at a banquet. In a bittersweet toast, he raised his cup, letting the warm liquid roll over his tongue like a soft joke, then set it down, choosing honor over a fleeting heart flutter, though the irony was he'd just turned his own life into a tragic rom-com script. Dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of vermilion and gold, and the village awoke to find their fields unharmed, and the bandits' tracks smeared into mud like an abstract painting. Takashi stood on the hill, the wind tugging at his kimono, feeling the Bushido principles settle into his bones like a well-aged sake, smooth, complex, a little intoxicating. He realized that honor isn't a rigid statue, but a living, breathing practice that can laugh at itself, like a samurai meme that says, "When you realize your katana is just a very pointy selfie stick." He thought of Tokyo's neon streets, where corporate warriors still whisper the old code before a deadline, trading swords for spreadsheets. In that quiet moment, Takashi felt the ancient discipline pulse through the nation like a drumbeat, reminding everyone that true bravery sometimes means holding a brush instead of a blade. When the Tokugawa shogunate finally tightened its grip, Edo blossomed like a lantern-lit garden of bureaucracy, its canals humming with wooden oars and the scent of fresh sushi mingling with the acrid smoke of blacksmith forges. Samurai rooftops, once austere watchtowers, now hosted tea houses where the clink of porcelain rivaled the clang of swords. The shogun's edicts fluttered like stiff banners, promising peace but also a strange, lingering emptiness for those raised on battlefield roar. Children in kimono chased each other through alleys, their laughter echoing off stone walls that had once heard war drums. Even the cherry blossoms seemed to sigh, aware that their fleeting beauty now outlived the purpose of the men sworn to protect it. Takashi, a mid-ranking bushi with a scar shaped like a sushi roll, stood at the edge of the castle moat, watching merchants barter for silk, while the distant wind carried the faint squeak of a distant kimono ribbon. He smelled the sweet perfume of incense and the sour tang of fermented soy, a confusing cocktail that reminded him of battlefield mud mixed with market spices. The former war cry now felt like a broken karaoke track, loud, off-key, and out of place. He whispered to his katana, "We used to slice through enemies, now we slice through paperwork," and a stray flea hopped onto his shin, as if the universe were mocking his existential crisis. The irony wasn't lost on him. A warrior whose greatest enemy had become boredom. A heated tea-house debate erupted that night, where senior samurai argued that Bushido could be grafted onto governance like a bamboo shoot onto a stone wall. One elder, his beard as white as powdered rice, declared, "Loyalty to the shogun is the new battlefield. No need for arrows, just signatures." The room erupted in chuckles, and a younger samurai quipped that their honor codes were now as flimsy as a paper fan in a typhoon. Takashi listened, feeling the room's incense swirl into a fog of nostalgia and irritation, while outside, a street performer mimicked a samurai duel with a broom, drawing applause from passers-by. The conversation teetered between reverence and ridicule, the scent of roasted tea leaves mixing with the rust of old armor, suggesting that even ancient codes could be rebooted like a vintage arcade game. In the following months, Bushido seeped into schools, where children learned virtues alongside arithmetic, their chalkboards smelling of soy sauce and sweat. Teachers, previously samurai turned scholars, brandished wooden swords to illustrate rectitude, striking the air with a clang that made the class jump like startled koi. Takashi volunteered to give a lecture titled Samurai Ethics for the Modern Salaryman, sprinkling anecdotes about loyalty with jokes about office coffee that could kill a dragon. The audience, a mix of merchants and retired ronin, giggled as he compared the disciplined stand-up posture of a warrior to the slouchy ergonomics of a cubicle worker, earning a round of applause louder than a temple bell. The lesson lingered like the lingering taste of miso broth, reminding everyone that honor could be practiced in a quiet study room as well as on a battlefield. Soon, the merchant districts buzzed with the clatter of abacuses and the hum of silk looms, and samurai began to wear silk ties instead of armor, their swords hanging like decorative lights in taverns. Takashi watched a young merchant, clutching a ledger with the fervor of a warrior clutching a katana, proclaim that profit is the new kanji of bravery. The irony smelled faintly of incense and burnt rice, a fragrant reminder that the old code was being repackaged for a capitalist era. As neon lanterns flickered like fireflies, a street vendor shouted, "Buy a katana-shaped USB drive," and Takashi laughed, realizing Bushido had become a meme, still sharp, still stylish, but now more likely to crash a computer than a castle wall. In that moment, the shadows of change felt less like a looming threat and more like a samurai costume party, complete with karaoke battles and the occasional accidental sword swipe. The sky over Edo roared as black smoke plumed from foreign ironclads, their cannon mouths yawning like monstrous dragon throats. Takashi, now bent with the weight of an age, watched the flags flutter like restless koi and smelled the salty sting of gunpowder mixed with fresh sakura rain. He heard the clatter of wooden shutters being slammed shut, a frantic percussion that reminded him of the battle drums of his youth. A nervous crowd whispered, "Is this the end of the samurai era?" as the distant gulls cried an ironic, tinny version of a pop song about destiny. Inside his tatami-lined study, Takashi unfurled the scroll of Bushido, the ink still smelling of pine resin and old ink, like a perfume for warriors. He ran a scarred finger over the calligraphy, tasting the ghost of his first sword kiss, a metallic tang that still tingled on his tongue. "Honor, loyalty, courage," he muttered, each word echoing like a karaoke duet of samurai virtues gone viral on old scroll-sharing sites. A stray cricket chirped a sarcastic rhythm, as if to say, "Even the insects are judging your choices." He wondered whether a code forged in blood could survive a tidal wave of Western denim and steam engines. The council gathered beneath lanterns that flickered like nervous fireflies, their smoke-filled breath mingling with the scent of roasted tea leaves. Elders in embroidered haori argued, their voices snapping like bamboo sticks, while younger reformers brandished treaties like swords from a sci-fi movie. "We need railways, not rickshaws," one shouted, earning a grin from Takashi that tasted like mischief and a dash of wasabi. The room vibrated with the clink of sake cups, the occasional snort of a bored monk who compared the debate to a season of Game of Thrones, all drama, no dragons. Irony dripped from every word, like rain on a lacquered surface, polishing the old and the new alike. Tempestuous rain hammered the roof, drumming a steady beat that matched the pounding hearts inside the hall. The smell of wet earth seeped through the shoji screens, reminding everyone that even the fiercest storms eventually clear. Takashi rose, his bamboo cane tapping the floor with a rhythm that said, "Enough." He spoke of the katana's song, describing its hiss as a whisper of loyalty that could still echo in the clatter of factories. A sudden laugh erupted when a younger delegate compared the samurai's resolve to a superhero's cape. "Just swap the cape for a kimono," Takashi joked, the crowd chuckling despite the thunder outside. When the final vote was cast, the lanterns flickered one last time, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits over polished floors. The decision, a compromise, part tradition, part reform, hung in the air like incense smoke, sweet and lingering. Takashi felt the weight of his ancestors lift, replaced by a fresh breeze scented with cedar and the distant hum of a locomotive. The future of Bushido, he realized, would be a blade forged from both steel and silicon, sharp enough to cut through any obstacle. And as the council dispersed, a lone cicada sang a lullaby that sounded oddly like the opening theme of a beloved anime, promising that honor, even when modernized, never truly goes out of style. In the neon glare of Shinjuku, Kenji Yamamoto stalks the polished marble lobby of Mitsu Corp like a ronin hunting a promotion. The scent of coffee and printer toner mingles with the distant hum of a vending machine that squeals out cold soda like a war drum. He clutches a battered notebook filled with verses from Takashi, a modern-day Musashi who scribbled Bushido wisdom on sushi-wrapped napkins. Each line, honor before profit, echoes through his mind as he watches a sleek executive flash a triumphant grin, his cufflinks glinting like samurai greaves. Kenji swears that the ancient code will be his katana in a battlefield of spreadsheets and PowerPoint swords. The quarterly meeting feels like a tea ceremony turned into a showdown, where rivals bow politely before launching verbal shuriken. Kenji remembers Takashi's counsel. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the resolve to charge even when the coffee is lukewarm. He steadies his voice, letting the crisp click of his keyboard mimic the clack of a katana striking bamboo, sharp, deliberate, unmistakable. When his competitor, Masato, tries to undercut him with a slick PowerPoint animation of dancing pandas, Kenji counters with silence that hangs heavier than incense smoke. The room crackles with irony, because in a country that worships kawaii mascots, a stoic samurai temperament still wins the day. Later, a client offers Kenji a bribe wrapped in a glossy chocolate box, the scent of cocoa battling the metallic tang of greed. He recalls Takashi's story about a samurai who refused a golden reward, preferring the simple rust of a worn sword. Kenji smirks, tasting the bitter irony of modern temptation versus the sweet resolve of his ancestors. He declines, feeling the cool palm of his own hand against the box, as if touching a koi pond that refuses to be polluted. The client glares, but the office thermostat suddenly sputters, releasing a gust of stale air that seems to sigh, "Good riddance." That evening, Kenji heads to a baseball game where the Yomiuri Giants swing their bats like swords, the crack of wood echoing through the night. The crowd roars, smelling popcorn and sweat, while a teenage fan shouts "Ikigo Iki," a phrase meaning one chance, one meeting, borrowed from the tea ceremony. Kenji sees the pitcher, a former judo champion, bow before each batter, his gestures a reminder that respect precedes victory. When the opposing team scores a run by sliding in a mud-splattered frenzy, Kenji laughs, noting that even mud can't tarnish a true warrior's spirit. He feels the pulse of Bushido in the stadium lights, realizing that honor can be celebrated with a hot dog in hand just as easily as with a katana on a battlefield. Walking home under a rain-slicked sky, Kenji hears the distant wail of a train, its rhythm like a taiko drum urging him onward. He thinks of Japan's national identity, a tapestry woven from cherry blossoms and the ghostly whispers of samurai ghosts who still tweet about diligence. In a world where anime heroes duel with laser swords, the ancient code of Bushido still whispers, "Be the hero who cleans up the cat litter after the battle." Kenji smiles, feeling the iron taste of resolve on his tongue, and promises to teach his junior colleagues the art of the respectful email, short, sincere, and free of emoji swords. As the city lights flicker like fireflies caught in a net, he knows the echo of Bushido will reverberate long after his own saga folds into the neon night. When the Meiji flag fluttered over Edo in 1868, the air tasted like fresh-cut timber and hot iron, the city shedding its kimono of samurai swords for a denim jacket of steel rails. Factories belched smoke that painted the sky a greasy orange, while street vendors hissed sizzling yakitori beside gleaming telegraph wires. Young samurai, once proud of their bamboo swords, now clutched bolt-action rifles like awkward smartphones. The old shogunate's tea houses gave way to bustling banks that smelled of ink and ambition. In that noisy crucible, Japan's old ghost whispered, "Upgrade or disappear." Inside the newly built Imperial Military Academy, cadets marched in crisp white uniforms that squeaked against polished stone, their boots echoing like a stadium chant. They devoured Sun Tzu's Art of War, while the cafeteria served ramen so oily it slicked the floor like a slip-end slide. One charismatic lieutenant, famous for his swagger, bragged that conquering a province was as easy as beating a level in Super Mario. Just jump, stomp, and collect the gold. The instructors tossed out feudal etiquette, replacing it with drills that made the cadets sweat like they'd run a marathon in a sauna. Ironically, these future generals learned to love order while their nation's streets roared with the chaos of rapid change. The Diet's chambers filled with politicians who sniffed the stink of coal mines and felt the pang of empty granaries, realizing Japan's islands were too tiny to feed an eager army. They argued over maps with the fervor of a reality TV voting panel, each point-blank claim about secure resources sounding like a commercial for instant noodles. A minister, flashing a grin like a meme lord, declared that oil was the new silk, and without it Japan would be stuck in a perpetual power outage binge watch. The room smelled of pipe smoke and cheap incense, mingling with the metallic tang of new naval contracts. Their ambition crackled like a live wire, promising that the next frontier would be seized before the next budget meeting. Army brass painted expansion as a noble quest, likening the nation to a tiger that had been cooped up in a bamboo cage for centuries. They rehearsed battle plans over steaming bowls of miso, the broth's salty bite matching the sour taste of looming war. Soldiers practiced amphibious landings on practice beaches that smelled of salt and diesel, their boots kicking up sand that stuck to sweaty socks like gritty confetti. Irony dripped from the banners that read honor and victory, while the underlying motto whispered, "More land, more ramen." With each enthusiastic shout, the crowd felt the pulse of a drumbeat that would soon echo across the Pacific. By the turn of the century, the seeds of ambition had sprouted into a tangled jungle of geopolitics, its vines choking the peace that lingered like fog over Tokyo Bay. The populace heard the distant thump of artillery rehearsals, a soundtrack that made children's toys seem as harmless as paper cranes. Whispers of a glorious empire fused with the clatter of factory looms, creating a symphony that was part industrial anthem, part ominous war drum. The nation, slick with oil and ambition, stood on the brink, eyes glinting like the neon of a midnight arcade. And so, the stage was set. A nation once bound by tradition now sprinted toward a conflict that would rewrite history with the ferocity of a samurai's final duel. The night of September 18, 1931, the moon slipped behind a veil of smoke as a lone explosion ripped through the South Manchurian Railway near Mukden. Japanese troops, marching in disciplined rows, swarmed the wreckage like teenagers storming a pop culture convention after a surprise cameo. The air stank of cordite and burnt oil, mingling with the distant wail of Chinese lamentations. In the cramped railcars, soldiers whispered about just a little incident, while the world outside stared, half amused and half horrified, as if watching a bad sequel to a samurai movie. The Manchurian Incident, as it would be called, set the stage for a march that would echo far beyond the tracks. Within weeks, the Japanese flag unfurled over the frosty plains of Manchuria, and the puppet state of Manchukuo strutted onto the map like an overconfident cosplay outfit at a historical reenactment. Local markets erupted with the clatter of horse-drawn carts, the smell of steaming bao mingling with the metallic tang of artillery shells. Chinese civilians stared at the newly minted courts, their eyes reflecting both dread and a strange, bitter humor, like watching someone build a theme park on their backyard without asking. Schoolchildren recited the new anthem, their voices echoing under paper-thin walls while the distant hills absorbed the distant rumble of armored trains. Everywhere, the landscape sang a discordant lullaby of occupation, ambition, and a faint whiff of incense trying desperately to mask the scent of gunpowder. The incident sent diplomatic telegrams fluttering across continents faster than a viral meme, provoking scowls from the Chinese nationalist government and stern rebukes from the League of Nations, whose collective gasp sounded eerily like a startled crowd at a surprise plot twist. In the polished corridors of foreign embassies, diplomats tapped porcelain cups, their clinks punctuating heated debates that felt more like reality show confessionals than statecraft. Newspapers in London and Paris printed headlines that smelled of ink and scandal, painting Japan as the bully in a schoolyard fight. Western powers, clutching their monocles, issued censures that floated like paper boats on the tumultuous river of East Asian politics. Yet despite the formalities, the underlying current was unmistakable. The world had just been handed a new, aggressive player on the chessboard, and the pieces were trembling. Back in Tokyo, the Japanese cabinet turned into a theatrical arena where moderates and hardline militarists squared off like rival factions in a Game of Thrones episode, except with fewer dragons and more cigar smoke. The moderates, sipping tea scented with jasmine, argued for a cautious approach, warning that overreach could scorch their own garden. The militarists, chewing on cigars as thick as plot twists, laughed, their voices booming like a rock concert bass line, insisting that only a swift, ruthless march could cement Japan's destiny. Their debates crackled with irony. The very men who sang about honor and restraint were drafting orders that smelled of gun oil and ambition. In a hushed corner, a young officer whispered a pop culture quip about going full Naruto, drawing a nervous chuckle that barely cut through the tension. When the dust finally settled, the march to the mainland had become more than a strategic maneuver. It was a grim prelude to a larger, blood-stained saga that would engulf Asia. The newly forged Manchukuo served as a launchpad, its streets echoing with the clomp of tank treads and the distant cries of displaced families. The world watched, some with popcorn, others with clenched fists, as Japan's shadow stretched farther, inch by relentless inch. Ironically, what began as a localized incident blossomed into a full-blown theater of war, proving that even a paper tiger can grow real teeth when fed enough ambition. The chapter closed with a foreboding silence, broken only by the distant howl of wind through broken walls, a reminder that history often marches to the beat of its own thunderous drums. By the mid-1935, Japan's streets buzzed with the roar of marching boots and the clatter of factory whistles, a soundtrack that sounded oddly like a heavy metal concert for an empire on caffeine. Imperial ambitions simmered like a pot of miso soup left too long on the stove, thickening with every whispered promise of Greater East Asia. Politicians in silk suits swapped polite bowing for blunt threats, trading tea for artillery blueprints. The public, half enthralled, half terrified, cheered as the Navy painted the horizon with sleek destroyers, each hull a sleek shark slicing through the Pacific. In short, the country was itching for a drama bigger than any kabuki stage. When July 1937 rolled in, Japanese soldiers stormed across the Chinese border like a swarm of angry wasps, their rifles singing a discordant anthem of conquest. Within weeks they descended on Nanking, turning the ancient capital into a nightmarish carnival of smoke, blood, and broken bamboo. Civilians screamed as fire ate wooden houses, while the stench of cordite and rotting bodies hung heavy like a bad sushi sauce left out too long. Historians later called it the Nanking Massacre, a horror show that could make even the toughest samurai weep into his kimono. The world gasped, half asleep, as newspapers printed headlines that read like bad horror movie taglines. Massacre madness. Back home, the military seized the reins of Tokyo's government with the enthusiasm of a gamer grabbing the final boss controller. Officers poured their slogans into school textbooks, teaching kids that honor meant marching in perfect unison while chanting, "Kill first, ask questions later." The media, now a puppet with a broken string, spewed propaganda that smelled of incense and cheap cigar smoke, glorifying the battlefield as the newest fashion runway. Student clubs swapped baseball bats for bayonets, and cafes served victory ramen topped with crunchy bits of ideology. Even the emperor, usually a calm lighthouse, flickered like a neon sign for the war party, making the nation feel as if it were stuck in an endless episode of Game of Thrones without the dragons. In September 1940, Japan signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, a handshake that looked like three villains in a Marvel movie plotting world domination. The agreement promised mutual support, as if the Axis were a three-way pizza party where everyone gets a slice of conquest. Berlin sent over its sharp-beaked Gestapo advisors, while Rome contributed flamboyant uniforms that could outshine any Shibuya streetwear. Japanese diplomats toasted with sake, laughing at the irony that they were now officially allies with the very powers that had once called them the rising sun in schoolyard taunts. The pact sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, making diplomats clutch their briefcases tighter than a gamer clutching a controller during a final boss fight. All these moves set the stage for a worldwide showdown that felt less like a strategic chess match and more like a chaotic karaoke night where every nation sang off-key about supremacy. The Pacific became a boiling cauldron, the air thick with the smell of oil, gunpowder, and the occasional whiff of burnt incense from hurried temples. Allies worldwide started loading up their arsenals, their war rooms humming like over-caffeinated bee colonies, ready to answer Japan's aggressive overture with their own thunderous chords. By the time Pearl Harbor's fireworks lit the Hawaiian sky, the world realized Japan had turned the road to war into a full-blown roller coaster, and nobody had bought a seatbelt. The consequences would echo for decades, reminding us that when a nation rolls its eyes at diplomacy and rushes headlong into conquest, the road ahead is paved with ash, regret, and a never-ending loop of what were we thinking. On a blazing Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, the Pacific turned into a fireworks display that no one signed up for. Japanese planes roared like angry hornets over Pearl Harbor, spilling gasoline and shrapnel across the dockside like a bad garage sale. The smell of burning oil mingled with the salty sea breeze, while sailors scrambled in their sleepwear, clutching coffee mugs like life rafts. In the chaos, the United States woke up with a start, realizing it had just been invited to the world's most unwanted surprise party. Flush with the shock of Pearl Harbor, Japan sprinted like a caffeinated cat across Southeast Asia, snatching Manila, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies with a swagger that could rival any superhero landing. The jungle air tasted of roasted peanuts and diesel, and the clang of conquered bells echoed in newly minted imperial flags fluttering over tropical rooftops. Local markets, once fragrant with fresh basil and incense, now smelled of rubber tires and the acrid bite of military rations. Yet for every triumphant shout, there was an uneasy whisper. The empire was stretching its legs faster than a yoga instructor on a deadline. Midway arrived like a cosmic reboot button, flipping the script with the drama of a Hollywood climax. 6 American dive bombers, perched on the deck of the USS Enterprise, swooped down and turned Japanese carriers into shredded paperweights, their decks smoking like a bad barbecue. The Pacific sky crackled with tracer fire, and the sea below churned with oil slicks that smelled eerily like burnt popcorn. When the dust settled, Japan's ace pilots stared at the wreckage, realizing their golden age had just hit a massive speed bump, one that would make even a snail feel like a race car. After Midway, Japan found its logistical arteries clogged with the stubborn reality of fuel shortages and overstretched supply lines. Ships creaked under the weight of empty cargo holds, and soldiers whispered about the lingering smell of stale rations that tasted like cardboard. The imperial machine wheezed like an old car trying to climb a hill, sputtering out of steam as allies turned into stubborn roadblocks. In the background, the empire's grand ambitions began to look like a diet plan gone wrong, a lot of promises, few calories left to burn. The United States, finally dragged into the global ring, responded with a blend of grit, resolve, and a dash of pop culture swagger. Think We'll Be Back meets Avengers Assemble. American factories roared like angry dragons, belching out planes, tanks, and a relentless optimism that could light up the night sky. Japan's once bright empire now faced a slow, inexorable sunrise that smelled of victory, sacrifice, and the faint hint of burnt incense. In the end, the flames of global conflict illuminated not just battlefields, but the stubborn truth that empires, no matter how fierce, can't outrun their own shadow. Allied warplanes roared over the Japanese home islands like angry hornets, dropping death from the sky with a relentless rhythm that made even the toughest kamikaze pilots wince. Night after night, the heavens lit up in an eerie orange blaze that turned Tokyo's streets into a living lantern festival, only the kind you'd never want to attend. Civilians huddled in basements, the air thick with the acrid sting of burning rubber, paper lanterns, and desperate prayers. The sound of distant artillery became a macabre soundtrack, a droned bass line that underscored the city's slow, inevitable surrender. It felt a bit like watching a long-running anime series finally hit its shocking finale, the kind where the hero throws in the towel and the plot twist is defeat. When the firebombing of Tokyo began, the city didn't just burn. It erupted in a firestorm that turned skyscrapers into giant matchsticks, and the sky rained ash like confetti at a very grim New Year's party. The heat slapped the air so hard that the smell of charred wood mingled with the sweet, stale scent of incense, creating a perfume no one would ever want to wear. Sirens wailed, but they sounded more like a DJ scratch record than a warning, a cruel beat that kept the rhythm of terror going. Residents watched rooftops melt into molten rivers, the whole scene resembling a massive, angry barbecue where the grill was the entire metropolis. Even the bravest soldiers muttered, "This is not the Tokyo you see in anime, more like a video game glitch where the graphics go from high def to pixelated ash." At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, the atomic bomb over Hiroshima flickered brighter than a Hollywood flashbang, a blinding white bloom that made the sun look like a timid nightlight. The ensuing mushroom cloud rose like a giant, ominous cotton candy, while the ground beneath turned into a searing skillet that could fry an egg in a heartbeat. Survivors later described a smell like burnt rubber and ozone, a perfume that made even the toughest chef cringe. The bomb's nicknames, Little Boy and Fat Man, sounded more like cartoon villains than instruments of annihilation, a darkly ironic nod to a pop culture showdown gone catastrophically real. In the eerie silence that followed, the city lay still, as if the world had pressed pause on a dreadful, all-too-real video game cutscene. When Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio on August 15, it sounded like an old vinyl record skipping, his words weighed down with a melancholy that could crush a sumo wrestler's spirit. "We accept the terms of the Joint Declaration of the Allied Powers," a phrase that read like a surrender note scribbled on a torn napkin, yet it signaled the end of the war's relentless grind. Allied troops rolled ashore, their boots thudding on the ruined streets like a marching band in a haunted parade, while the smell of diesel and fresh rain mingled with the lingering scent of ash. Japanese citizens stared at the foreign soldiers, half expecting to see a cameo from a sci-fi film where the heroes turn out to be the villains. The surrender felt like a gamer finally losing the final boss after countless no-life loss attempts, the screen flashing "Game Over" in stark, unforgiving letters. In the months that followed, Japan began to stitch its shattered neighborhoods together, brick by brick, like a weary artisan patching a torn kimono with neon-bright fabric. The air filled with the clatter of construction, the scent of fresh timber, and the occasional whiff of miso soup from hastily set-up street stalls, a comforting reminder that life, like sushi, can be rolled again after a spill. Amid the rubble, cherry blossoms erupted, pink petals fluttering over ruins like a gentle reminder that even the toughest warriors need a moment of soft scenery. The new pacifist constitution, penned with the same solemnity as a final episode script, promised that future generations would trade swords for pens, and battle cries for karaoke nights. Japan's rebirth was a bittersweet sequel, part tragedy, part triumph, proving that even after the darkest of endings, the story can still get a surprising, hopeful spin.